we are talking about big world global events. We have got our Prime Minister very firmly on the international stage, proving to the world that he can be a statesman. But I'd also draw your attention to Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, where actually it felt to me, and some of my colleagues and indeed commentators have pointed to this, that actually Sir Keir Starmer was very comfortable in that space also, talking about, big geopolitical events, and in some ways made some of the kind of heavier points than Sunak did, who effectively stood back and agreed with him.
Some up-to-the-minute political analysis from the Sunday Times political editor, Caroline Wheeler. Hello, Caroline.
Good morning.
Good morning. Gaza. What's happening with Rishi Sunak? What's the latest? What's going on?
What, in terms of where he is?
In terms of where he is, what he's doing and why he's there.
So he's come back now. He came back last night after a kind of whistle-stop tour of the Middle Eastern countries, talking to all of our sort of Western allies about how we're going to respond to this particular crisis. Obviously, we've seen overnight some more positive news in that the Rafah border has opened this morning, but also that we've seen the release of 2 hostages, which has largely been attributed to some of the work that Qatar has been doing in terms of back-channeling with Hamas. Mm-hmm. So it's been an important week for the Prime Minister, talking to our allies, trying to cement what comes next, really, because there's still a huge question mark over when a ground invasion is going to begin. We've already got a number of British nationals still on the ground in Gaza. There is some suggestion that there may now be a way out for them, potentially. The US Embassy this morning has talked about potentially opening up the Rafah border to people with dual passports, and one can only imagine that facility, if that eventually occurs, will also be available to UK dual nationals. So there is some more positive news on the kind of on that particular front at the moment. But this has really been about a kind of show of strength. Biden has also been in the Middle East as well, and basically, a very clear message to Hamas and also to the rest of the Middle East that we stand with Israel in this particular conflict and crisis, but also that there needs to be a focus on the humanitarian work that's now done to help those in Gaza where the situation is deteriorating hourly, if not daily.
Look, it's maybe an obscene way to talk about it, so I'll tread carefully here, but is there some political opportunity here for the Conservatives? I mean, obviously, if Jeremy Corbyn was still leader of the Labour Party, they would be trying to make some very dramatic, clear blue water between the Conservative approach, the Labour approach. That's sort of hard. We'll talk about Keir Starmer's own issues in just a minute. But is this the sort of thing that, in terms of just having a big geopolitical thing to deal with, it's slightly useful for Rishi Sunak to show himself as a Prime Minister, or not?
Well, if it's interesting that you frame it in those terms, because actually, if you remember COVID, this was very much one of the places where Boris Johnson felt most comfortable. When he was Prime Minister, actually dealing with a very big international crisis very much suited his kind of skill set. Yeah. And I don't mean this in a kind of callous way, but sometimes when international events take over, everything kind of domestically quietens down. Yeah. And it's quite interesting that we're talking about that in the context of the 2 by-election defeats, because ordinarily every news bulletin for days will be sort of leading with the kind of, hand-wringing and, depression within the Conservative Party at, what has just occurred, which is a 20-point swing in both cases towards the Labour Party, and, predictions even amongst the sort of most eminent pollsters that this is going to, potentially seed sort of annihilation for the Tories at the next election. But instead, we are talking about big world global events. We have got our Prime Minister very firmly on the international stage, proving to the world that he can be a statesman. But I'd also draw your attention to Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, where actually it felt to me, and some of my colleagues and indeed commentators have pointed to this, that actually Sir Keir Starmer was very comfortable in that space also, talking about, big geopolitical events, and in some ways made some of the kind of heavier points than Sunak did, who effectively stood back and agreed with him. So I don't think it necessarily wins them any great political capital, but it is in some ways useful as a kind of diversionary tactic away from the kind of internal fighting that's clearly going on behind the scenes in the Conservative Party, which once again seems to be ripping itself apart.
Turning to Labour for a minute, we'll come back to the Tories in a second. 6 more Labour councillors have resigned over the party's stance on Israel and Gaza, this time from Oxford City Council. Obviously, for the sort of the Corbynite wing of the party, what remains of it, this is kind of the last straw. Does he really have a problem here, Keir Starmer, or does he sort of have the opposite of a problem? Is this a way of just sort of showing the British public that that's who we were, that's not who we are anymore?
I think they're having to tread carefully. I don't think it's easy for them to sort of tread, a particular line on this, which is the kind of, condemnation of Hamas, but also, recognising that there is also a humanitarian crisis going on the ground in Gaza. I mean, my understanding is that when Sir Keir Starmer had to kind of issue a sort of revision on what he'd said, and he sent that letter out to local councillors, there were other shadow cabinet members that were dispatched to kind of, very clearly explain that they felt that there had been a foot that was kind of out of place there, and that it hadn't been kind of, Sir Keir Starmer hadn't said really what he wanted to say. So they were nervous about that particular kind of statement that was made. But at the same time, I think they want to very firmly show that the Corbyn era is closed, that chapter has gone, and that they have a very different response to these kind of issues than under his tenure. So I think in that particular sort of way, they are sort of using that and capitalising that. But at the same time, they realise that it's a very, very difficult issue for them, and that they do have people who feel very passionately and very strongly on these issues. So I think that you will see them continue to kind of both be strong in their support for Israel, but potentially be a little bit more cautious about what they're saying on the other side.
Turning back to the Conservatives post-by-election, the Times today reports the Conservatives are considering an aspirational pledge to slash stamp duty to try and turn around the party's fortunes. Is that worth the cost? Is that likely to happen? Would it cut through to voters? Is this all just a bit desperate?
Look, I think one of the things that has gotten back to Number 10 loud and clear is that actually at the Conservative Party conference, there was a sense that the promises that were being made were very negative. It was about cancelling HS2. It was about cancelling smoking. It was about ripping up A-levels. It wasn't exactly a positive, visionary, hopey-changey kind of agenda. Whereas on the flip side, you saw Sir Keir Starmer, OK, not with the kind of most sexy of policies, talking about changing connections to the grid and speeding them up and, accelerating house building and all of those kind of things. But that was at least a positive vision and agenda for Britain, actually doing something that was going to help people, that was going to potentially change the picture around growth in this country. So I think that message has gone back loud and clear, that they need a more aspirational, hopey-changey agenda. But in my view, what they're doing is reaching back into that old drawer of ideas that has been sort of turned to over and over again to dust off policies that have worked for them in the past, that have potentially, for a few weeks or a few months, given some alleviation from some of the kind of issues that are affecting people in terms of buying houses. But these are very kind of, short-termist issues quite often. Stamp duty holidays are usually for a very limited period, because stamp duty does still raise quite a lot of revenue for the Treasury. Similarly, they're talking about inheritance tax, again, something that's kind of totemic within the Conservative Party, but not something that really changes very much for people, given that only 3% of people ever pay it. So it does seem that they are kind of, what's the word? They're kind of desperately sort of looking around for things that may be able to change their fortunes. Again, this is something that's being looked at in the manifesto, because we don't have the money to do these changes, which is why we're not likely to see any big tax cuts either in the autumn statement or in the budget. But, expect to see a bit more kite flying. I think they need to be offering people a more positive future, positive vision for the future. So I think you're going to see more of this.
The Gillian Keegan thing this week, where her point was basically, no, there wasn't a swing against us, our vote just stayed at home. Do they genuinely think that? And is there any chance that they might be right?
It's really interesting. It was almost a script, and it almost makes me cynically wonder whether it was a script, because those are exactly the words that a number of MPs said to me yesterday, that they were not really concerned about the results because it showed that their vote wasn't coming out, and that, I think the idea of suggesting that there wasn't a swing to Labour is a little bit far-fetched, because
the biggest swing.
It was the biggest swing, absolutely.
Yeah.
But you look, I think there is a sense, and there has been for a while, that this election is going to be determined on those kind of don't knows, or those apathetic voters, of which there are, we understand, a large number, potentially up to a third of the electorate now fit into that particular category. We did a piece in the Sunday Times a couple of weeks ago about a new kind of mould of voters, which are known as the super distrusters, that don't trust anybody anymore. They don't want to, they're not attracted by anybody's politics. And so it is going to be, the next election is going to be, I think, determined by that group of people. The analysis that we've seen is that that those people that generally stay at home and are apathetic are more likely to be Conservative voters. So there is definitely a phenomenon of the sort of shy Tory voters, which is something that we've seen historically in by-elections. So yes, they are pointing to something. But I think when you see that scale of a swing, that number of people that have clearly either switched sides or have decided that they proactively want to go out and vote Labour, that number of people that have potentially turned away from the Tories and voted for the Lib Dems, for example, as they've been claiming credit for, I think that does point to something within the political system that suggests that we are heading towards a Labour government, if not a Labour majority government.
And what's the mood like within the Conservative Party? The Times also reports this morning on the WhatsApp groups, which seem hairy. What is there a lot of anger at the leadership, or is there sort of fatalism?
Well, both, really. I think that the Conservative Party conference did not fill people with optimism and hope. I think they thought the messaging was all over the place. I think the fact that we were talking about HS2 for weeks and weeks and weeks prior to the conference, which basically obliterated everything else at that conference. I think, as we've already discussed, the negative nature of the debate has also irritated colleagues. But I think there is now a kind of sense that the pendulum is turning, that we are now facing towards the prospect of a Labour government, that some of those more dire predictions that have been made about the scale of defeat may actually be true. And I think that the by-election results were a real dose of realism for some of those that have been thinking things potentially could get better. I don't think that everybody thinks that it's absolutely game over. I think most people think that the Conservatives will lose. I think it's the margin that people are still debating over.
Sure. Thank you very much indeed, Caroline Wheeler.